Hello, and how are you today? It is our first Sewing in Slippers with Sue for 2024, and I want to welcome you. If you are a fellow applique enthusiast, you are in the right place. Welcome to another cozy episode of Sewing in Slippers with Sue. I'm your host, Sue Pelland, and we are here today to talk about quilting in 2024. I am so thrilled that you have joined me today to start your journey into the world of beautiful applique quilts. And I love to talk about our lives and how our quilting life is intertwined with our everyday life. Now, of course, for 2024, so many people are making New Year's resolutions. And I want to talk to you a little bit about that. So, in our first segment today, we are going to talk about an alternative to New Year's resolutions and doing something just a little bit more meaningful. Okay. In our, so our first episode is talking about resolutions. And our second part of the episode is going to be talking about gratitude. So, of course, we want to start our new year off on the right foot and putting our mindset in the right place so that we can get so much accomplished in 2024. And we can do that together with the best heart and having our heart in the best place possible. So that's how I want to start off our Sewing in Slippers today. And we're also going to get into some tips for flawless fusible applique. So one of my newest students said she was having trouble cutting curves with her Leaves Galore tools. So we're going to dive into 6 tips for flawless curves when you're cutting with the Leaves Galore tools. Then we're going to finish up our segment with what is on your nightstand. I want to know what you're reading. Maybe what you're reading will be an inspiration to other quilters. I'm reading a couple of things right now that you might be interested in. So I'll share with you what's on my nightstand, and then we can have a little discussion about your favorite books and what you recommend to others. So I want to dive right in, start with a great positive mindset, and dive into 2024 in the best way possible. So sorry, I don't know how to turn off these notifications and they keep dinging here. So apologize for that. I will figure that out. So that's one of my focuses this year is focusing on the little details, making sure that I give my students and my customers the best experience possible at SuePellandDesigns.com. And I want to start focusing on the details. I am a big picture person, and I sometimes lose track of all those little details. So I'm going to put that on my list to find out how to turn off those notifications so that we have a better episode of Sewing in Slippers with Sue. So today I want to start off with a little bit of gratitude. I don't know about you, but I want to start each day of 2024 being just that much more focused on gratitude than I was last year. You know, we make these New Year's resolutions, and sometimes by the end or even the middle of January, we've petered out. We've lost our focus, and we've lost the concentration that we need to make those resolutions a reality. So I'm going to change from making resolutions to changing my focus. So this year, I want my focus to be on a daily gratitude practice. And that means just taking a little bit of time each day to come from a heart that is grateful for everything that I have, everything that I'm able to do, having this fabulous community around me, and being able to do what I love, which is applique. So I do want to share a book with you, and it's called Feeling Grateful. Now, I was the lucky recipient of this book because I have a very good friend out there, Bev Henyon, you know who you are, who gave me this delightful little book. And quite honestly, until this week, I didn't take the time to read it, even when she gave it to me with this beautiful little matching bear that goes with the book. I didn't take the time to appreciate it and to read this book. And Bev, for that, I want to apologize. But I want to share it with all of you because it's so important to put us in that gratitude focus. So I'm just going to read a little excerpt from this book. It's just the introduction or the first couple of pages of this book, just to put us in the right mindset for starting a gratitude practice. Now, this is my focus for this year. It may not be your focus, but I love to share this with you because I feel as though starting each day with just a touch of gratitude puts me in the right mindset to deal with difficult things more easily and to focus on what's important in my life. So let me just start by reading the first page of this delightful little book, and my little bear there is just waking up in the morning. But this isn't a children's book. This is a book for everyone. So let me share what the author, Kobe Yamada, has to say, and the illustrator is Charles Santoso. So Kobe says, gratitude isn't just something you have, it's something you learn and develop. It's a life skill. You can grow your capacity for gratefulness. You can captivate your ability to pause, to look around, to be surprised and delighted by the world around you. When you slow down, you can better honor and feel the gift of each moment and the opportunity that comes with it. So I'm going to be reading this book over the next couple of weeks on our Sewing in Slippers with Sue, because I do want to start our sessions with gratitude and know that I am so grateful to you for being here today and for sharing this moment with me. And I want to share that moment of appreciating what's around me. I went to Trader Joe's the other day and I bought myself this gorgeous amaryllis. I just have to share this with you. I'm so delighted that this amaryllis is now in full bloom, and you can see this second blossom over on the side that's going to take over, and this is going to be blooming probably for a week or more. So I'm super excited about this. And what does any of this have to do with quilting? Well, it's when I take the time to notice these little things around me, especially the beauty of these flowers, of butterflies, of anything in nature. When I truly look at the details, I see elements from my design. I see quilt patterns waiting to happen. So this amaryllis has really inspired me because look at those basic shapes of the 6 petals. Those are absolutely shapes that we can recreate with rotary cut applique. Even those beautiful buds. Look at the inspiration just from the bud itself. I'm going to put a piece of paper in between the flower and the bud so you can see that. Look at the amazing color in that bud, how it's tipped with green, and then it goes into this beautiful red. And then when it explodes and when it opens up, turns into this fabulous, beautiful amaryllis flower. Look at the throat of that flower, the red inside, the little stamens coming out, which would be a wonderful opportunity for embellishment. And there's even a little frilly inside dimension to that flower. You can see it up here where it's very three-dimensional. It's absolutely beautiful. So going back to that passage from the book, she's talking about when we slow down, When we slow down, we can better honor and feel the gift of every moment and the opportunities that come with it. So I am looking at each moment as a gift, and it is a gift to be here with you today. So that is day one of my New Year focus on gratitude. So I want to dive right into what I mean by focus for 2024. I hate New Year's resolutions. I really do. I feel as though it has such a bad connotation because nobody has confidence in New Year's resolutions anymore. New Year's resolutions are something that is almost gotten to be joke worthy, right? Because so many people set resolutions and then they just fail. They fail to live up to those expectations they have for themselves, and they get disappointed with themselves, and you beat yourself up when you don't meet your New Year's resolutions. So I want to have a focus for 2024 instead of setting a whole bunch of resolutions that I may not stick with. So let's talk about our focus for 2024 and how that word to me just allows me to, and I'm going to place this word everywhere, this focus word. I'm going to place this around on my monitor here. I'm going to put a little sticky note on my monitor. I'm going to put it at the top of every page of my notebook. I'm going to go through the next 20 pages of my notebook that I have next to me all the time. And on the very top of that page, I'm going to write focus so that I can focus on what's important. I can take time and slow down and make my focus on the important things in life, which are to me, my family, my community, my online community here at Pelland Designs. My family is my extended family. It's not just my immediate family here that lives in my house, but all those people whose lives touch mine every day. So sorry about these notifications. I need to turn off all notifications. Thank you. Okay. See, I lost focus there for a minute but you know what? I just found a better way to do something because I took the time to stop those notifications from bothering you every couple of seconds and distracting me. So I really do want to focus this year, and I want to focus on my family, my students, my customers, and do a better job for each one of them by focusing on what is important. Now, one of my focuses this year is going to be communication. I tend to do a very poor job of communicating, and I'm writing down communication because that's going to be one of my focuses this year. I tend to assume people know certain information if I share it once. Even if I share it twice, I forget that people have busy lives and that they don't always pick up on my communications the first time around, that I need to share more communication with my members, my students, my customers, even my family. So communication is going to be a big focus for this year. By setting a specific focus for the year, what I'm hoping is that this focus turns into a habit. So the focus on gratitude, the focus on communication, I want these to be more ingrained habits that I focus on every single day. So I hope that you'll see some of that in our Sue Pelland Designs world. So one of the things that I hope to do is to really focus on sewing in slippers with Sue and bringing that into our newsletter every week, bringing these topics that we're talking about into my blog post each week, and really keeping my focus for the week on what we're talking about here in Sewing in Slippers with Sue. Now, that focus on a communication, really extends to my students. That's really where I want to pay the most attention to that focus of communication. So last week, I reached out to a new member of Ahead of the Curve. That is our membership where people want to learn the techniques that I teach for fusible rotary cut applique. So I reached out to Eileen last week, and she's a fairly new member. So I wanted to see where she was enjoying Ahead of the Curve and where she was struggling. And one of the areas where she was struggling was getting nice, clean cuts on her applique edges. So in our third segment today, we are going to talk about improving your applique abilities with 6 tips for smoother rotary cutting. So I'm going to do a little demonstration for you now so that I can get right into the meat of our typical topic for sewing in slippers with Sue. Now, I don't usually focus on New Year's resolutions. I don't normally focus on my goals for the year. What I want to do is help you with your goals. So if your focus this year is on learning some new applique skills, I hope this next segment will help you do just that. So I'm going to turn my camera down to my workstation. And let's see if I get it right the first time. I've got a couple of different cameras here. And that's the right one. It's just a little bit out of the screen here. So there we go. Let me get behind the camera, and I'm going to be focusing on showing you some tips for getting smoother applique cuts with your Leaves Galore tools. Now, in order to do that today, I'm going to start working with the Leaves Galore Petite tool. Now, there are 3 different sizes of Leaves Galore tools, and as you get to the larger sizes of the tools, it gets easier and easier to cut those curves because your tools have a greater area for that curve. So as you get smaller, I just noticed there's all kinds of moss on me from that beautiful amaryllis. So I've got it all over my sweater here. Sorry about that. So as you get into these smaller curves, that curve gets tighter and tighter and harder to cut. So my first tip for getting beautiful cuts with your curves is to start with a larger curve. And so I'm going to start with a larger piece of fabric here. Now, when you're cutting with the Petite Leaves Galore tool, there is a 5-inch curve on one side and a 2.5-inch curve on the other. By just turning your tool around, you're going to be able to cut 2.5-inch leaves and 5-inch leaves. Now I'm saying leaves because that's the most common shape that we cut with our tools, but there are lots of other shapes that you can cut. So my first tip, tip number 1, is start cutting with the larger side of the tool. And that's going to give you a little bit of practice around those curves. Now, once you've made that beautiful cut, you can use the dash line on your tool to make a second cut. And that's where you come out with these gorgeous little leaves or melon shapes. So what happens when you practice cutting with that 5-inch curve? Well, I don't want to waste a lot of fabric. So I'm just going to slide over, and I'm going to give you my number 2 tip for getting beautiful curves when you're cutting. My tip is to cut with your table down low. If I can put my hands on the table and stand up perfectly straight with my palms resting on the table, that's the right height for cutting. If you're cutting up high, you can't get the leverage to push down on the top of that rotary cutter to get good cuts through 4 layers of fabric. So my second tip is to Start with your hands, your palms on your table. Stand up straight and adjust your table height for cutting. This table that I have can be lowered or raised with a little crank of a handle. And if you don't have a table like that, you can adjust your table legs by putting bed risers under them. And my recommendation is you take all of your risers out from your cutting table and have your cutting table down low for rotary cutting curves. Now, why is this important? Because tip number 3, you want to cut with the tip of your rotary cutter. Do you see where the rotary cutter blade is most exposed? It's right there at the tip. So if I hold my rotary cutter almost upright on my table, I'm going to get the most cutting surface available with that rotary cutter. If I'm laying my rotary cutter down like many people normally cut, do you see that you're resting that plastic on your table? So you have to go up to make the table contact the blade and not the plastic that goes around the blade. Now, when your table is down low, it's much easier to get your rotary cutter up high. You want your rotary cutter to be almost upright. Now, it's not at a perfect 90-degree angle like this. You are going to lay it down a little bit, but you want to go where your blade is exposed and not on the side where the plastic is. So tip number 3, cut with your rotary cutter up high. Now we also are going to hold our rotary cutter in the palm of our hand, making a straight line with our arm so that we can put all of our strength into that cut, and the pressure from the cut comes from our shoulder all the way down into that rotary cutter tip. So in order to not waste any fabric, I'm just sliding over slightly, and I'm going to cut with the top of my rotary cutter blade. So you want to be in a comfortable position for cutting. You want your hand so it's nice and straight, so that you're not putting your hand at an awkward angle for cutting. You don't want to be doing this. You want your hand and wrist to be straight so you can get that power from your shoulder all the way down into your cut. Now, if you can cut nice and cleanly like this, okay, nice and clean all the way around, that's what you need to make beautiful rotary cut shapes with no jagged edges. So let me give you one more tip for cutting beautiful shapes with no jagged edges. As you start to cut, your hand on the left-hand side is going to be on your ruler. I'm going to keep 2 fingers on the ruler, 2 fingers off the ruler, and my middle finger is going to be halfway in between. It's actually resting on the ruler, but it's touching the fabric up here. Now, what does that do for me? Having 2 fingers on the ruler secures that ruler, and I've got the Grace True Grips on the back, so it prevents that tool from shifting as I cut. So pressure on the ruler where those Grace True Grips are prevent that tool from moving. Your kickstand over here, your other fingers are going to be securing your fabric and your ruler together. So if you are pressing on your ruler beyond where the Grace True Grips are, so I actually have a couple of fingers beyond my Grace True Grips, and I'm just going to press on that tool, then the fabric has nowhere to go under there. If you're keeping a nice secure pressure on that ruler, your fabric is not going to move under the ruler. Now, as I'm cutting, you'll notice that my hand that's cutting is lined up with the hand that's holding the ruler. I'm going to walk my fingers up like this. I call it the spider walk. I'm walking up like a spider on the edge of the tool to keep my cutting hand and my holding hand in alignment with each other. And that's going to ensure that I'm putting pressure where it needs to be where I'm cutting. If I'm cutting down here and I'm only putting pressure down here, First of all, that rotary cutter is likely to push your ruler, and it moves your ruler away from the edge of the fabric. You need pressure on the fabric and on those gray screw grips to contact the fabric all the way up the fabric as you're cutting. So with those 6 tips, you're going to get beautiful, smooth edges on your applique pieces. Now, once you have learned these 6 basic tips, I want you to turn your ruler around and start cutting with the smaller side. Now, I am going to use the 3-inch tool just because this last cut was made with the 3-inch tool. And I'm going to give you one bonus tip today. I want you to start cutting a 1/2 inch at a time and then regroup and reposition your blade so it's going to continue to hug that curve 1 inch or even a 1/2 inch at a time. By practicing very slowly, you're going to see what's happening. And if something is moving or shifting or not coming out clean, then you're going to be able to react to that before you've wasted any fabric. So I've cut once. I'm going to slide my tool down by 1 full leaf shape. Now this is a 3-inch leaf. So I actually slid my ruler down by 3 inches. Now I'm lining up the dash line on the tool with the line that I've just cut, and I'm going to cut again. Now you'll notice my thumb is way down here where that first curve is. The second curve is there, no problem. And I moved my pointer finger out to this third curve so that I can secure the fabric under that curve and make sure that the fabric is coming in contact with the gray screw grips and nothing is moving. That's how you're going to get beautiful, nice, smooth curves every time you cut. Now, because I'm just practicing, I'm only using 1 layer of fabric. So there's another bonus tip. Start with 1 layer of fabric, and you don't even need to fuse that fabric. You can absolutely start with fabric that isn't fused just for your practice. Now, what you also might want to do, even before you start practicing on your fabric, you can always start by practicing on paper. Now, I like to make my first cut with that eye right there about 1/4 inch above the edge of the fabric, and make sure you've got a little smidge of fabric on the sides as well, maybe about 1/8 inch. Now, just like your rotary cutter, you can go from the bottom and just mark that line just as you would be cutting. Now you can slide that template either up or down by 1 full leaf shape. Now I'm wiggling my tool to make sure that the dash line on the tool falls, right in line with the line that I've just marked. Now, normally I would be cutting this line, but on paper, I can just mark this line so you can see what's happening with these leaves. We're going to place our leaves side by side, offsetting every other row of leaves by 1/2 a leaf, so that when I make an entire paper filled with leaves, I have used my paper in the best way possible. Now, you're going to notice when you're cutting with fabric, you don't want to waste any of that precious fabric and fusible. So practice this way on paper so you learn how to fill that space in the best way possible. If we start with our eye 1/4 inch above the edge of the fabric with our first cut, when we make our next set of leaves, we've actually got the A 1/4 inch from the edge of the fabric for our next set of leaves. It's the middle of that inside curve, but the real secret is to put this curve right here, right between these two curves. So that way you're nesting your leaves one beside the other and making the best use of your paper or your fabric. Now, why would I do this on paper? Because I simply want you to be able to see what it looks like to cut 3-inch leaves right next to each other and utilize all of that fabric. Now you've just got this little tiny bit of waste right here, right here. It's so small that you can just throw that away, but I often have fun using those fused pieces as well. So let's look at our 6 tips. I'm going to see if I can remember them in order. So we're going to start with a large curve. Okay, so that's tip number 1. Tip number 2, you're going to slide over ever so slightly so you can practice without wasting fabric or practice on paper. Tip number 3 is you're going to, I don't know if these in order, I can't remember. We're going to use the top of our rotary cutter blade. Top of blade. That means we have to, number 4, we have to keep our table down low. Okay. Tip number 5, if we start with the large curve, we practice on paper first so we know how we're going to move our tool. We're cutting with the top of our blade and we have our table down low. Tip number 5 is to slow down. Tackle that curve 1 inch at a time. Okay? And tip number 6 is you don't need to use fused fabric. You can practice on unfused fabric. You can use your ugly fabric from your stash that you don't care about, or you can fuse your fabric and actually be practicing while cutting pieces for an actual project. And that's what I did today. I'm going to be using these pieces in an actual project. So I did tell you that we had some bonus tips. I'm going to run through this video again and make sure I got all 6 tips in order. Make sure we get those bonus tips written down for you. And I will include a picture of this in the show notes at the end of today's session. And I'm coming back to you so I can get back on the screen and look at any questions that you had while I was giving you some tips from behind the table. I can't see the computer when I'm behind the table like that. So let's go ahead and I'm going to close that down so I can see all of your comments. Well, welcome. You are getting better, but you still have some jagged edges. Okay. So we absolutely did not talk about the number 1 tip of all, and that is start with a sharp blade. So I'm going to put that as tip number 6. Start with a sharp blade. Okay. And next week on Sewing in Slippers with Sue, I'm going to get 6 more tips for you. So if you make these slight adjustments or these big adjustments to your cutting style and you still have some rough edges, I'm going to tackle 6 more tips next week, and then we'll put all 12 tips together. I'll create a video for our members in the technique session so that we have a little checklist for you. We're going to create that checklist so you can make sure you're doing everything the way that I do it. And once you get into those habits, you're going to have smooth edges every time on your rotary cut shapes. Okay? All right, so I'm going to put this aside. I'm going to continue to work on that, and we'll add to this list. We'll end up with 12 tips for beautiful edges on your applique shapes. So let me just resettle in here, and I want to share with you what is on my bookshelf. But before I do, I want to see if there's any questions out there about anything that we've talked about so far. And I want to share with you some of the observations I have made by slowing down and really observing nature, enjoying the little details, and how that's going to add to my creativity. Lori says, my resolution was to change blades in my rotary cutter and the needle in my machine. And I'm going to say, Lori, anytime you start running into trouble, either with your stitches not being beautiful, your thread breaking, anything like that, changing your needle is the number one first thing I do. Needles are cheap. You don't realize what abuse your needle takes just by going in and out of your fabric all the time. If you look under a microscope, your needle tip can get a little slightly bent, and that's going to cause you problems in your stitching. So it is microscopic. You can't even tell that you have a either a dull or a bent needle tip. So you want to change your blade frequently, even if you think it's a nice new blade. To some people, new is once a year. To me, new is for every 6 hours of sewing. Okay. Most people say 8 hours of sewing, but they're not doing blanket stitch applique. I do it more frequently because that blanket stitch applique, there's a lot of up and down with that needle, and there's a lot of concentration in a small space. So my 6 hours of sewing is probably equivalent to 8 hours of sewing straight lines because of all those additional stitches in the blanket stitch. So I change my needle really frequently, and anytime I'm starting to run into a little bit of trouble. Okay, and changing your blade in your rotary cutter, same thing. Blades are not cheap, but when you look at the cost of fabric that you might ruin by using a dull blade, it makes sense to keep a sharp blade in your rotary cutter. Now, you need a sharper blade for these curves than you do for straight lines. We can even talk about that next week, why that's the case. But you need a sharper blade for curves than you do for straight lines. So I change my blade more frequently when I'm cutting curves. And I'll keep one rotary cutter for cutting curves, so I know it's a super sharp blade. And then I'll swap it out for the one that I'm cutting straight lines with. Because even if my rotary cutter is not getting perfectly straight edges on my curves, it will cut straight through straight lines. So I will reuse that blade, even though it's old for me for cutting curves. It's perfectly fine for cutting straight lines. So yes, we are going to be changing our blade more frequently. We're going to be changing our sewing machine needle more frequently. And that is a great focus for this year, to remember to do that, to focus on those little details. You write the date on tape and stick it to the front of the machine. I love that, Lori. So you're doing that for your sewing machine needle. You can use that same piece of tape and you can mark your rotary cutter with curves. And then that rotary cutter, you can write the date right on the handle. You can wrap a piece of tape around it or put a little piece of sticky tape or a label on it. And you can date your rotary cutter as well. I don't bother to do that because once you get confident cutting the curves, you'll be able to tell when your blade is dull. And you'll know what I mean as soon as you get confident with cutting your curves. So stick with it. You will get there. Now, if you're still having trouble cutting your curves and getting nice smooth edges, come back next week and we'll give you more tips for getting smooth edges on your rotary cut curves. Now, if none of those tips helps, then I want to see what you're doing. So in our membership, you can come to one of our live sessions. We have 2 live workshops a month, and we have a live sit and sew on an all-day Friday. If you're struggling, I want you to come to those live sessions because I can help you. You can turn your camera onto your cutting station and I can actually see what you're doing. You can see what I'm doing, and we can work out all the details so that you get beautiful cuts with your curves. It's not hard, but it does take practice. So stick with it. We'll practice together and we'll get you smoothly cutting curves in no time at all. Now, I do want to remind you to put your name with your comments because I don't always see the name here on StreamYard. Kathy, welcome. Happy New Year to you. A beautiful plant, isn't it? Yes, Happy New Year, Elaine. I'm glad that you are all here today. And are there any blade brands that you won't use? Good question. I haven't found a brand of blade that I won't use. I do feel as though some brands dull more easily, but I don't keep good records of those things. And I can feel when it gets dull. So I simply just replace it when it's dull. Now, if I do use a less expensive brand, and they are out there, I find that they dull more easily. But a lot of that depends on your rotary cutting mat. So those are some of the tips that we will explore next week are some of the details with your supplies themselves. So I'm going to remember to talk about mats next time, and I'll put that on my notes for next week. And we'll get into a bunch of other tips so that we're going to make sure that you're cutting beautifully by the time you watch next week's session. Okay, so what is on your bookshelf? What is on your nightstand that you are actively reading right now? Well, for those of you that know me, you know that I love audiobooks. So I'm going to go to my audiobooks on my phone. And I'm currently reading Ties That Bind, a novel by Marie Bostwick. Now, I don't know if you know Marie Bostwick. This is let's get over here. This is the cover of the book right here. And I am 51% done with this book, and I'm listening to it. I've got 6 hours and 45 minutes left. This is what puts me to sleep at night. I put my books on tape, I put my earbuds in, and I fall asleep beautifully when I'm listening to a book on tape. It's really nice because you can put a sleep timer on that will go to the end of the chapter, or you can choose a certain number of minutes to fall asleep with your book on tape. So it's really fun for me to listen to a little portion of the book before I fall asleep at night. And then if I wake up early in the morning and I have a half an hour before I have to jump out of bed, I'll put the book on again. So I'm currently reading Ties That Bind, a novel by Marie Bostwick. Now, Marie writes about a group of quilters, and this particular book is about one of the employees at a local quilt shop in Connecticut. So I love the fact that it's local to me. It feels like they're right next door. They're talking about places that are all around me, like Sturbridge and Boston and Connecticut, of course. And it's just a sweet novel about a young lady who has become responsible for her 6-year-old niece. So I won't give away any more of the story, but if you've read it before, I would love to know how you liked Marie Bostwick's book, Ties That Bind. Now, she has many, many different books, and this is the first one I have ever read. Now, I've met Marie because she comes to Quilt Market sometimes to sign her books because they all do have a quilty feel to them. She has also worked with Deb Tucker. Deb has designed quilts that are featured in Marie's books. Now, Deb and I go way back to our vending days and our days in Houston, and we've become quite good friends over the years. Now, we've lost touch a little bit because I'm no longer vending at the shows, so I don't see Deb anymore. But I have always had an affection for Deb and her creative entrepreneurial mind, her amazing tools that make pieced quilts easier. And I love the fact that she and Marie are friends and have collaborated on these books and on these designs that are represented in the book. So I started following Marie years ago after meeting her at Quilt Market, but I don't tend to read this type of novel. I tend to read more historical fiction, and I tend to read a lot of nonfiction. So I will share another book that's on my nightstand with you, but I'm really curious to know if anyone out there has read Ties That Bind or any other Marie Bostwick novel, and how do you like them? Are they too light? Sometimes light is fun, and sometimes we just need something that's enjoyable to read rather than overly thought-provoking, because when it's overly thought-provoking, sometimes I can't sleep after listening to a section of that book. So I'm really curious. Put in the comments if you've read any of Marie's books before. Loved the Cobbled Court series. I'm reading an advanced copy of the Book of Doors. Oh, isn't that exciting? And who is that Facebook user that's reading the Book of Doors? Of course, I can check Facebook later and see who that was, but I'd love to know. The Cobbled Court series. See, I haven't read that, and I'm looking forward to trying it. Pat Bryant, you're out there today too. Welcome, Pat. All right. So what else is on my bookshelf, or what else is currently on, I say my nightstand, but I don't read at night in bed. I read in the morning while I'm having coffee with my husband. Now, that's not real reading. It's just kind of perusing these books. But some of the books that I've been perusing lately are about historical quilts. Now, you're going to learn a lot more about my focus this year in 2024. I have another focus on historical quilts and on the makers of those quilts, but mostly on fabric. Some of you know that my history is as a textile chemist. I worked at Cranston Printworks Company, one of the oldest printers in the United States. Now, unfortunately, that company is no longer printing fabric here in the US, but I have a passion for the history of textiles, especially in New England. So one of my focuses this year is to put a little bit more effort into my education about historical quilts and the fabric in them. So this is one book that I picked up recently, Glorious American Quilts, the quilt collection of the Museum of American Folk Art. That's the museum in Manhattan. I've been to that museum several times. I have not been to a quilt exhibit there, but they have a fabulous permanent collection of antique quilts, and I wanted to study some of those antique quilts. Many of you know that my passion is for applique, and a lot of these antique quilts that I love to study are beautiful applique quilts like the one right here on the cover. Well, normally I just peruse these books looking at the beautiful pictures. Sometimes I'm like a 5-year-old that only wants to look at the gorgeous pictures in the book. But what I find is when I do that, I miss all of that rich history about the women who made these beautiful quilts. So now I've actually gone back to the pages that look like this, chock full of information written by the director of the Museum of American Folk Art, written by researchers, the best researchers in the field of antique quilts. And I'm currently just getting started with this book, but already I am completely fascinated. And I've come to the realization just recently that I want to further my education in textiles and really dive into the history of our American quilts. So you will find that theme popping up all year long, because not one of my resolutions, but one of my focuses this year is to further my education in the area of textiles. All right, so let me read down your comments here. I want to make sure that I don't miss anything. My mom used to call those types of books M&Ms. Not as good chocolate, but still fit the need at the time. She would send me a box of these type of books at the end of every semester. Debbie, that is wonderful. M&Ms, not as good chocolate, not that rich, luscious chocolate, but it hits the need at the time for something sweet, something fun, something that you can just savor and dive right into, sink your teeth into without spending the money on that expensive chocolate. So funny, Debbie. I just love that. Sue, you're talking of meeting everyone at the quilt shows, and it makes me ask. A question came up, and do you know who developed the 4 flying geese method? I do not know who developed the 4 flying geese method. I'm sure you could do a little bit of research on, you could Google that 4 flying geese method, probably go back on, it's earlier than YouTube. It's earlier than, it's definitely earlier than YouTube. So no, I don't know who developed it, but I bet you could find out with just a little bit of research. Now, I have not done the 4 flying geese method in a very long time. I actually forget how to do it. But if you YouTube that and you watch the YouTube videos that are written about it, you might come across the history there. But that's a really great question, and I would love to find out the answer. So when you find out the answer, please share that with me. Okay, fantastic. All right, let me just go further here and make sure there's no more questions. Looking forward to more applique. Yay. And absolutely tell me how you like that advanced copy of Book of Doors. I'm really curious about it. Is it also set in a quilting backdrop, right? Is there quilting in the book, or is it one of her, she does write other books that do not have any references to quilting, from what I understand. But again, I haven't read any of her books, but I'm looking forward to having some of that light M&M reading. All right, ladies. Well, thank you so much for joining me on this very special first episode of Sewing in Slippers with Sue. I've got my slippers on here, and I'm going to dive right into a couple of projects that I still have to finish. I have to finish my temperature quilt. That is the next thing on the list. This week, I finished a quilt for a friend of mine who was afraid to do a scalloped binding. So she made a king-size quilt, scalloped binding, beautiful feathers around that border, and I put on the binding for her. Now, I did not film as I was doing that, but if you are in the membership Ahead of the Curve, we do have a technique video on curved bindings and doing a scalloped and a serpentine binding. That's also one of the chapters in my book. Well, I hope you've had fun today diving into my New Year's focus, and I hope it makes you think a little bit about what you want your focus for 2024 to be. My focus is definitely on, and I'm looking for my little book. I don't see my little book here. My focus is on gratitude. This little bear right here is going to remind me to focus on gratitude every day, read a little bit more of that book every day, and I'll share a little bit more of the gratitude book with you next week on Sewing in Slippers with Sue. I want to make sure that I covered everything. And don't forget that in the show notes, I will be adding those 12 tips for successful rotary cut applique. We did 6 tips plus a couple of bonuses today. We'll do 6 more tips next week. Then I'll put the checklist together for 12 tips for successful rotary cut applique, and I will include that in the show notes next week. This week, I'm just going to give you a snapshot of those 6 tips that I thought of off the cuff as I was going through the video. I'm going to double check that video, make sure I get all those tips written down. And next week, we will have the rest of the 12 tips for beautiful rotary cut fusible applique. Well, thanks for joining me today, and I can't wait to see you on the next episode of Sewing in Slippers with Sue. Thanks for joining me, and Happy New Year.